Good afternoon. This is Connie McLaughlin and Christy Overton with the MUI unit here at the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. We'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, where we're going to be talking about the incident tracking system changes that align with the revised MUI rule that will go into effect in January 2019. Now we're going to go ahead and get started. So basically, the purpose of today's webinar is really to talk about what MUI rule revisions have had an impact on our application. And so we'll go through those kind of line item by line item. We're also going to talk about where it's possible we have added some efficiencies and tried to minimize administrative burden. And I'm getting some feedback that our audio is a little crackly. So I'm going to try to make some changes here, and hopefully that will help. The third area we're going to talk about in today's presentation is addressing some known bugs or glitches in the ITS, or the incident tracking system. So where we were able, we tried to make those fixes with this release. And then finally, we're going to talk about Children's Services Board's investigations and how we made some changes to the incident tracking system to better capture those findings and investigation results. So if I could get a little feedback from our internal office staff how the audio is doing, that would be great. Okay, so I'm hearing that it's still difficult to hear. So I'm gonna keep trying here. We're going to go ahead and move along. It says, okay. In terms of the incident tracking system, we're going to go through and talk about the process a little bit. So a lot of you know that the process for making changes in the application are really kind of extensive in terms of making the changes. We have to go through a testing process. Obviously, there's developers through our IT staff that make those changes. Then we go through the process of testing and retesting. I'm still hearing a lot of feedback that the audio is having difficulties. So I really apologize. We haven't really had this occur before. I don't know if it's better if we try to call back in, but I'm going to go ahead and finish this slide out. So we're in the process right now of testing, and we anticipate that our changes are going to go live in the incident tracking system in January, on the 2nd, actually, January 2nd. And then obviously there's going to be a lot of changes, and based on your feedback, we'll go ahead and make adjustments. So we understand the process. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's really a process where we're going to continue to make improvements and adjustments based on your feedback. A lot of what we are talking about in changes in the ITS system is going to require us to kind of work through this process together. We're going to be constantly changing our guidance documents to reflect any future guidance about what should be filed and how it should be filed. We're also going to really look at the intake process to make sure that what Butler County puts in aligns with the rule and aligns with what Hamilton or Cuyahoga or Brown County are putting in. So that intake process is really kind of the gatekeeper to make sure that when incidents are being entered into the system, that the MUI rule is being applied consistently across the state, and that it's within the interpretation that the department has set out. So what you might see is some additional questions or conversations really about how things are being entered and if it really does align with the changes that have been made within the rule. And then finally, we're going to talk about the implication of these changes on existing data reports. And just to let you know, we really are in the process of testing all of this out to make sure that any changes that have occurred within the application itself are going to be able to be sustained in the data warehouse. We want to make sure that, you know, the reports that you're utilizing today, that things like the MUI form report and other reports are really going to be usable tomorrow, knowing that these changes are being made. So those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about throughout today's webinar. And so I'm going to turn this over to Christy, and she's going to talk about the application changes that were made to align with the MUI rule revisions.
We'll start with some of the categories that we changed the names of, not drastic, but unscheduled hospitalization has been changed to unanticipated hospitalization, and unapproved behavior support, just a slight change, it's now unapproved behavioral support. Those are just a couple of the name changes. The next set of things that we're going to talk about are some of the drop-down categories. So for unapproved behavior support, we used to have prone restraint just go directly to physical abuse. It has been added back to the unapproved behavior support category, and it's now in the drop-down. And we're not saying that we will not bump it up to physical abuse if it happens to be, but we will start with it under unapproved behavior support, and then as you go through your investigation, find out more information. If it's plausible or needs to be bumped up, then we can change it to physical abuse. One of the other things that we're looking at is medical emergencies. When you click on medical emergency drop down, there are about 20 or 30 different categories in there now. Well, we've kind of combined it all to where it meets these 5. So you have the AED, the chest compressions or CPR, the choking relief, which should include your back blows, your Heimlich maneuvers, your finger sweeps, the EpiPen, and any other life-saving intervention. For that one, we're thinking of the Narcan or anything else that is emergency needed. We did take away the use of IVs or people pulling out their IVs that used to be listed under medical emergency, and we added the AED information in its place. Under the next tab, when you're in the ITS, you will find the Data Info tab. We did make some changes in the law enforcement section. So we've added not only for the charged, incarcerated, and arrested, but we have put tased in there as well.
Okay. One of the other things that we tried to do with the MUI rule itself, but also with the application that supports the rule, the incident tracking system, is to look at ways that we might be able to create some efficiencies where it makes sense. I'll let you know that there were at least two meetings we had with stakeholders. And so there were county board and COG representatives. We had about 15 to 20 different representatives on a work group, real informal work group, where we talked about reporting and application changes. And they provided some feedback and really helped kind of cement the things that we want to focus on in terms of what makes sense from an investigative standpoint, what makes sense from an application standpoint. So where it made sense to create some efficiencies, we tried to do that in the application. We want to reduce any kind of duplication. We want to reduce maybe information that was being entered into the system but wasn't being utilized. So you'll see some of those changes as we go through the presentation here. But just to give you a little bit of a summary of what we're looking at, so you know right now we have group MUIs for things like peer-to-peer, neglect, misappropriation. Moving forward, we're going to have the ability, if one individual has multiple MUIs categories kind of stemming from the same event, moving forward, that person would have one MUI with, say, 3 different MUI categories. Where we feel that creates some efficiencies is obviously less cutting and pasting from the county board or the COG person. You're not looking at having multiple written summaries, possibly different investigation files. We feel like we can reduce some duplication there. So we think it makes sense in that regard. Where we looked at it and where the group talked about it is, okay, how far can we take this in terms of things if there's multiple peers and multiple different categories? And we found that there were some limits to that. First of all, did it make sense? And also, what kind of application changes would need to be made? And so some of the decision points we came to were that if there's a failure to report that comes out of, say, a neglect or abuse, and that may be a group incident, we believed that that should be filed separately for a couple different reasons. First of all, there's going to be different discovery dates. So, you know, you're maybe midway through your investigation and you find out that someone didn't report that properly. In addition, that primary person involved, or the PPI, may be would be different than, say, the neglect or abuse that you're initially investigating. So we're going to call that out as a separate MUI. We know, and we want to be very clear that through this process, we're going to continue to work with you and try to provide some guidance on what things should be filed and how. And we're only going to do those things if it makes sense from an investigation standpoint and efficiency standpoint. So if it doesn't make sense and it compromises in any way the quality of the investigation or how that process occurs, then we don't want to make those changes. So just want to make that clear. So what we talked about is having the ability to add multiple categories to one MUI. So in this screen, it kind of calls out, you can see here it has the ability to add allegation categories and decided categories. We have the ability now, or moving forward, we will have the ability to have 19 different categories added. Now, we all know that that's never going to happen for people that we support, because as we joke, you can't accidentally die and then die non-accidentally all in the same day. And but we do have the ability there. As we go through the screens, we'll walk through that, how this is going to occur, but in terms of adding this out. So you can see lower here, you're going to have the ability to add things. And like I said, one person may have one MUI with multiple different categories if it's related to the same event or stemming from the same kind of circumstance. So I think sometimes it's easier to walk through some examples. So we've provided a scenario here where, let's say there's an individual that has 2 or more related MUIs. So that may be a unapproved behavior support and a missing, because they all kind of happened all at the same time. That may be one MUI for that individual with 2 categories. If you have an individual that had 2 unrelated MUIs in the same day, let's say Christy was at her day program and fell, and then came home and alleged abuse against someone that works at a residential home. 2 unrelated incidents, those are probably going to be filed as 2 MUIs. So hopefully that makes sense, where we tried to create some efficiencies where if it seems like it was all stemming from the same event, then, and it made sense, we would make that one MUI with multiple categories. However, if it seemed totally unrelated and it really didn't make sense, then we're going to keep those as 2 separate MUI filings as we have them today. So as we go through this presentation, please don't hesitate to ask questions, and hopefully the audio is a little better than what it was before, and we'll continue to kind of have the conversation and work through these issues. We wanted to provide another kind of example in writing, and so we'll give you a minute to read through this, and then we can talk about how, moving forward, we would file this in the incident tracking system. Okay, I think we've had enough time there. If you guys want to type in your responses, what do you think? How many different MUI categories or different MUIs would you have? We just want to make sure that people are really awake and alert out there. So I see a couple responses coming in. Okay. Great. So we have some people that said a unscheduled or unanticipated hospitalization would be filed. We have some people that say 2 separate MUIs would be filed. So as we work through this process, it really is kind of learning how kind of a new way to rethink this whole process. And we're certainly going to be involved with all of you to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page when it comes to this. We're going to show you how we would have that filed in ITS moving forward. So for Temmie's incident, obviously he went missing. There was a one-person escort utilized, and then he was later hospitalized. And we felt that those were all somewhat related for Temmie, as it kind of all stemmed from the same situation. So for this incident, we have 1 MUI for Temmie, and we have 3 separate incident categories. So this is kind of a departure from where we have been filing things right now. And so we understand it's going to take a little bit of time. And this is certainly, this kind of filing is not going to be what we do for every MUI, obviously. So these are kind of some significant cases where one individual's involved in multiple different MUI categories in the same day, around the same time, kind of stemming from the same thing. And so what we did with our data analytics group was we were able to drill down and look at these cases, and we could see that where we could create some efficiencies were, you know, looking at the MUIs, and there were a lot of MUIs that were filed for one individual all on the same day, and it seemed to be somewhat related categories. And so where we go from here is trying to figure out how to kind of operationalize everything, obviously. But this is kind of where we thought we would start. And so again, this is not going to be the case for every MUI you have, but if you believe it is related, you know, certainly you can consult with your regional manager or one of the intake managers like Christy Overton or Dan Butler or myself, and we can walk through what makes the most sense. What we don't have currently are hard, fast rules around it has to be within 12 hours, it has to be within 6 hours. So we're looking at related categories or kind of things that stem from one event, and usually in a close time frame. And so these are the kind of things that we're going to be working out with you. And we've had a lot of really good questions come in, and so we're going to try to address that as we go. And so a lot of times what some of the questions are like, well, what if it happens later in the day? And so we're asking you really to look at, you know, what seems to be the root cause? What is the, what are you seeing as something that kind of encompassed that situation? And, you know, a lot of times it's talking it out with someone. Does it make sense? If it doesn't seem related at all, like one thing happened at work, one thing happened at home. It really didn't seem to be related, somewhat isolated, those situations, then we understand that doesn't make sense. And we certainly only want to have these MUIs with multiple categories if it makes sense from an investigation and from, a data entry kind of perspective. And so we're going to go ahead and move on and try to give some additional examples, and hopefully that will clear up. And we've had some people say, well, how would we know what the root cause is at the beginning of the investigation? That's a very good question. I'm not saying that you're going to know that all the time, but you may know there's something that's contributing to those other things happening. If someone is having psychiatric issues, that may have caused them to run away from home, and then also to display a lot of physical aggression towards their peers or to staff, that may be something that contributed and may have resulted in all of these things kind of co-occurring at the same time. And so, those are the kind of things we're looking at. Christy, did you want to add something?
The important thing to remember for this is just the alleged category, not the decided. Some of the questions that are coming through have to do with the investigation and how you decide what's what and where it's going to be at the end. These are just the initial allegations based on what you would normally get from your providers or what you would normally see from your incident report. And you call us and you say, well, which category would you have it be under? These are the categories that we would put it under, and then we could always figure out what actually the decided category is later.
And so this might be another example where you might see one individual or an MUI that has multiple categories. And so for this one, it might entail an alleged neglect and a peer-to-peer act. And so again, this, like Christy said, this is on the alleged category. So you may see incidents where, the neglect, say someone wasn't provided or peers weren't provided the appropriate supervision level, and a peer-to-peer act happened. And so both of these things are going to be looked into and investigated, and probably during the course of the investigation, they're kind of going to be looked at, during the same investigation process. So in this case, it may make sense for these things to be filed together and those things. We recognize that, obviously a written summary or some kind of communication that goes out to a guardian or individual is going to have to be specific to whatever that allegation type is. But oftentimes there's cutting and pasting from a report anyway. And so we feel like if this makes sense to do it this way, to have one MUI with multiple categories, then that's the reason for this change.
And it will help some because Dan and I do see the incidents as they come in. We will get a peer-to-peer, and then next we will get the neglect MUI filed, and you'll say refer to this one, or half the information in the peer-to-peer is not the same as the neglect, even though they're the same case. So this will cut down on some of the questions that we have to ask, and you trying to decide what information needs to come out of one MUI and be added into the other without cutting and pasting the entire thing.
Yeah. And so we're going to continue on, and we're going to leave time at the end for some questions. Hopefully some of these will be addressed throughout the presentation. You guys know that Christy Overton, in addition to doing intake, also handles a lot of the information for mortality reviews and works with our physicians and sits on the mortality review board. So she's going to talk next about deaths and unanticipated hospitalizations and how those can be combined moving forward if an MUI is open and based on certain criteria. So I'm going to let Christy talk about that next.
I know a lot of you are most of the time upset because I make you file 2 MUIs. Well, we're trying to cut down on this. So if a person goes into the hospital and dies while they're in the hospital and the hospitalization is still open, you can now add a decided or add a death category to the allegation category. So at one point in time, we had people putting in an alleged category of hospitalization, and then the decided category would be the death, and we were trying to capture the information where we would miss a lot. Now, if a person is hospitalized, they actually die while a hospitalization is still open, I need you to go back to the alleged category and put in the death as well so we can capture both incidents. And then when you get to the decided category for this one, you will still have to put in both because they were actually hospitalized and they did actually die. And the decided category will capture both of the MUIs, and then I won't have to ask you all those annoying questions or make you put in additional information.
All right.
If, unfortunately, a person goes into the hospital and they die after the hospitalization due date, and you guys have closed it, and they die after that, we actually will need a second MUI filed for the death. And when you get ready to close the case or you come up with your decided categories, because we're now letting you file them together for the unanticipated hospitalization and the death, the incident date will probably reflect the day that they went into the hospital. So it is very important that when you get to the individual tab, there is a box in there that has the date of death. That is the date that I need that comes off of the death certificate. So it won't exactly match the one on the front because once again, the incident date on the front is the unanticipated hospitalization, but the date of death is something different unless they go into the hospital and die on the same day.
So just to make that clear, if it's not already, and I think Christy did a great job discussing that, if an MUI is closed, we are not going to open up a closed MUI or one that has been recommended for closure to add additional categories.
Correct.
And that's for a death case and any other case that we have, correct? Okay, excellent.
Or any of these other cases, if you find out, for instance, a peer-to-peer, and you find out after you've recommended for closure that there was also neglect on the staff's behalf, then we would ask you to open up an additional neglect as opposed to changing it.
Okay, we have several questions if you're okay with fielding those.
No.
Christy. So one of the questions is, what if the hospitalization MUI is still open a month later and the person dies after being discharged?
If it's still open, we can go ahead and put the death in there because most of the information that I will need for the death case will be in the hospitalization. And so you can just continue to put the information in there. As long as it's not closed or recommended for close, you can add in the death.
Okay. And I think there's a lot of little details that we'll need to continue to work out. And so what we'll try to do is we'll commit to having like a frequently asked question guide for the incident tracking system. And we'll try to capture all these great questions and comments that you're making. Another question we have related to death is, will there be different information needed for death of a consumer based on the multiple categories?
Most of the, if I'm understanding your question correctly, most of the information that will come from the hospitalization is what I already need for the death. So when you add the two categories together, it is basically you telling me what's going on before that person got into the hospital. So in the death categories, I need the 72 hours prior to death. Well, this is your opportunity to look into the hospitalization and say 3 days before they went to the hospital, they were fine, or this is what was going on. And all of the hospital information is pretty much leading up to the death, so it will cut down on a lot of the questions that I have. So there's nothing really different. You'll just add more information into it.
And that is one thing that I think, and maybe you have this as well, through your work, but I know the regional managers, when they're reviewing MUIs, and let's say there's a related neglect and then a hospitalization and possibly a death, you know, they are going back and forth between multiple MUIs. And so we hope that this cuts down on some of that, and so that all the information and a comprehensive report that still gets at all the needed information for those specific categories, but it's all found in one place. And just to further clarify, someone had a question. So if an individual dies while they're in the hospital, then we do not need to enter a new death MUI, just update the hospitalization.
No, what actually happens is you probably filed it as hospitalization. So you will go back to that. I don't know if you can go back to the slide in front of that. You'll go back to the allegation tab and then add in as an additional allegation the death category. So that way now both of them are captured. Initially, it was just the hospitalization, but the person died, so I need that added to the alleged category as well.
So correct, it would not be a new MUI. You would add an additional non-accidental death or accidental death to the alleged category on the open hospitalization. Correct. And so one thing that we're really asking, and it's critical, is that when you know and learn or discover of someone passing away, that you enter that into either a new MUI or an existing MUI for unanticipated hospitalization as soon as you know. The reason for that is if it's an accidental or suspicious death, we have specific reporting requirements around that, things like director's alerts and other kinds of alerts. Additionally, we have things that we need to do on our end and mortality reviews that need to happen. And so we're really asking if you can make sure that that information is entered in as soon as you have it, we would really appreciate that. We know that many of you have voiced concerns that you don't like filing two separate MUIs, so we feel like we have cut down and reduced that, but in doing so, we also have to make sure that we're getting the information we need around death cases as soon as you have them. Okay, so we're going to move on to transportation-related incidents.
Due to the increase of transportation incidents that Dan and I see up front, we kind of wanted to put in a drop-down that addresses some of these issues to capture the different types of trends and patterns that we see for any kind of car accidents, van accidents, where the staff is distracted or the driver is impaired, if the individual is left unattended in a running vehicle or while the staff runs inside, reckless driving, and a lot of, unfortunately, where the wheelchair is not secured, the straps are not put the way they should be. We wanted to start capturing that because we see an overabundance of these happening.
And the whole point of this quality improvement process is about prevention. This isn't just about tracking and having data. It's about coming up with solid prevention plans, education, and reducing these incidents. We're seeing significant amounts of injuries occurring to individuals because of these things that Christy talked about, where people aren't being secured in vehicles. You know, maybe they're being secured in their wheelchair and their lap belt is on, but the tie downs that, you know, they're utilizing in the van are not being properly secured. And so we hope that you'll use this as a platform to talk to providers in your area about this trend that we're seeing around transportation-related incidents and neglects. And we'll hope that you'll use this information and this data that we'll have available to you to really use that to inform your stakeholders about what we can do to reduce these incidents from occurring, because by and large, most of them are preventable. And so a lot of it speaks to people being in a rush, people not having the proper training, And so we want to be sure to let our stakeholders know this is a trend we're seeing, this is something that we care deeply about, and we want to make sure that you have the information you need to be able to come up with a good, solid prevention plan for that incident, but also to look at trends across your counties and your COGs. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the data info tab and some changes that we've made there. You know that right now, for every MUI that's filed, there are some specific kind of static areas that you have to fill out. One of them is supervision and the other is behavior support information. First of all, behavior support plan is a little outdated since that's incorporated, those strategies are incorporated into individuals' person-centered plans. But what we really wanted to do was reduce some of the duplication or unnecessary information. And so these two areas are going to be removed for every MUI, and they're only going to be found in the data info tab when one of the categories has been selected. So let's say there's a neglect, then you'll see this information. It's going to be very incident specific. That might populate the supervision levels. If someone has a unapproved behavioral support moving forward, then only then will you see this information about behavior support strategies that you'll have to fill out in the data info tab. So again, we tried to reduce some unnecessary data entry and really focus it and make it more targeted on whatever the MUI category or categories are for that one MUI. So hopefully you'll see this as a very positive change. I think we do. Under the individual tab, we are looking at, for many of you, you know this, but for our new investigative agents and MUI contacts, the individual information used to be populated from the IDS system, and now it's coming from the CRM system. And so what you'll see here is some changes in the living arrangements. And so if this looks a little different, that's why all of this information, once you've entered in what the individual, it auto-populates this based on what's in CRM. Sometimes we get people say, well, you know, this information isn't accurate. This person isn't 99 years old. Well, this is an information that we put in through the MUI system. This is information that the county board or COG has entered in. So if there is an issue you believe with this information not being accurate, then probably the best course of action is to go back to the person at your county board or COG that might be responsible for entering that information in. But please just know that that's coming from the CRM system. We have multiple applications that feed into the incident tracking system. One of them is the provider service management application that pulls in the provider information, and then the other is the CRM. And so those are kind of what we consider records of truth, and so that will populate into our application. So the next area we want to talk about is the provider tab. And we had some pretty extensive changes based on some of the feedback that we got from our stakeholders. And so one of the things that we heard through the MUI rule review process, which we met with some stakeholders over a period of over a year, was that in certain times there are multiple incident providers involved in one MUI. So one example might be, let's say Christy is coming home on a van from her day program, and Jody is coming out to receive her. Jody is with her residential provider. The transportation staff is dropping Christy off. Jody may witness something occurring, maybe physical abuse during that transition period. And so there may be two incident providers at the time. The other time when this might come into play, which is the feedback that we receive from stakeholders, is sometimes when there's a systems issue, when there's multiple variables that contribute to, let's say, a neglect, it might involve a county board, it might involve a residential provider, it could involve a day program provider. Currently, our system really only has the ability to have one incident provider. And so let's say there's a case of a systems neglect. Really, the way it currently happens, most of those are tagged to the residential provider. And so the feedback that we got from providers of service were, well, if that system also involves the county board, then why aren't they also listed in the incident provider? And why aren't those kind of things also happening and also being captured on their like annual analysis and their reports? And so we thought that was pretty good feedback, and so we tried to make those application changes to accommodate their feedback. And so as we go through, we'll show you how that looks in the system. So obviously you guys are all familiar with the provider tab here. Currently you can only select one incident provider, but we're going to go crazy and let you select multiple now. And so this is just an example, and this is not a real MUI. This is one I just created, but it shows that we have two incident providers here, the Delaware County Board and the Alpha Group of Delaware, and you can see both are listed as the incident provider. So you would just select the provider and then select them, and then you could go ahead and do the same thing to add another one. And so you could have multiple incident providers for the same MUI. The next area we want to talk about, again, is in the provider tab, but we thought it was important to talk about making sure we capture accurate information when it comes to the provider. And so you'll notice, and we'll talk about it a little later, but we have the ability to select the provider based on whether it's an agency, whether it's an ICF, whether there's no incident provider. And one of the things that we're seeing sometimes is that provider reports are not accurate. So we may get a call in our office where we are talking to provider ABC, and they say, this did not occur, this didn't occur through my agency, or I know this MUI happened while this person was at our day program, but it's not on my report. And then when we look into the incident tracking system, that incident provider is not accurately reflected. And while we know this happens from time to time, where we see it happening more often than not is when the incident provider is an ICF or an immediate care facility. And so sometimes what happens is, in a rush to get something entered into the system, let's say that, it could be VOCA, it could be CRSI. CRSI happens to operate, they're certified. In addition, they also have licensed facilities, some of which are ICFs. Instead of picking the specific licensed facility, they're putting CRSI in there. And so what's happening is it may not show up correctly on those provider reports. And it's so important for providers to be able to look at trend information by specific facility. And so we're asking your assistance to make sure that when you're entering information in, especially when it's an ICF, that you're specifically putting that ICF. And we know it's difficult because sometimes the names, might be by the street name. It may be something completely different than what you know it to be associated with. But you try your very hardest to identify it with the correct facility. And if you're having issues finding it, and we know that happens as well, please don't hesitate to call us. Oftentimes we can look at a database and see who the parent company is and see what ICF is associated with them within your county. So we just wanted to have a little reminder there about making sure that that information is correct. Next, we're going to talk about the Others tab.
There have been a few changes in the Others tab. when you currently click on the Others tab, you will see for a systems issue, there's a box that says, click here if it's a systems or unknown PPI. What we've done is we've separated those two. So the box at the top will just now say systems. We've added the unknown PPI down under the relationship section, which is on the next tab. As you can see it now, if it is a systems issue, it will show up under the relationship tab, under drop down.
And so here it is right here where you'll see unknown. And the reason we wanted to separate those two out is because currently in our data warehouse and our reporting, it shows it's as either one or the other. And we thought it was really important. We could get to the data, but it was difficult to really kind of tease out which one was the unknown PPI versus which one was a system. We think it's important to report back to you and to our other stakeholders how many times we have an unknown PPI versus how many times it's a systems issue.
With this, you will also be able to pull from the categories that Connie was talking about where we have multiple incident providers. Now they will show up under the incident provider, and you can now associate the PPI with whatever agency they work with. So if your alleged PPI works for the Alpha Group, you will click on the PPI, their relationship information, and then click on the Alpha Group, and then it will show up at the bottom. So now that we are able to track what provider the PPI works with, and it'll show up on the screen. So you don't have to wonder, and we don't have to ask a bunch of questions.
Yeah, and as you know now, if you were to, if this drop down was selected and you would select peer, it would auto-populate the multiple peers that were involved in that peer-to-peer. Just like that kind of logic, if there is multiple incident providers and you select PPI, it's going to auto-generate who those incident providers have been identified on the provider tab.
And this is just how it will look once you pick that information. If you do the PPI, their relationship, and then what agency that they're associated with based on the provider information. Under the Summary tab, this is one of my favorite places. When you put in your initial report and your immediate actions, when you are first putting in your MUI, there are a lot of questions that Dan and I ask over and over and over again. So we thought we'd give you a little help by putting some prompts on the page, because I know when you're trying to get this information in before you get timed out or you have somewhere else you have to go, you put in the basic information, but you don't really think about all the things that we need to know right away. So for each category, this one is category specific. So for each category, there is a list of questions. If you have a neglect case, your questions will be, was there contact, is there still contact with the alleged PPI? Was there a medical assessment? What has been done to reduce the recurrence of this type of incident before the investigation is completed? If it's a death case, the prompt will be, was CPR initiated, 911 call, was the coroner notified? If you have a misappropriation case, the questions that we normally ask, adequate funds to meet the person's need, does the PPI still have access to the individual's money? So these are just basic prompts to help you get all the information that we need in, and then you won't get those annoying questions from Dan and I, and you can move on to something else or move on to your investigation. These questions actually will go away, or these prompts, I should say, will go away when you pick a decided category.
So again, these are just things that are frequently asked questions, and we use it more of a training and development kind of thing. And yeah, so it's just a little helpful prompt.
Just to trigger some of the things that you might not have been thinking about, because you have all the basic stuff, but it might have been, oh, I didn't think about that question, or I forgot to find the information to that question.
And more often than not, we find that the county boards and the providers have taken the action already. It's just maybe it's not documented in the incident tracking system.
Right.
And so we always try to encourage people to, you know, we know you're doing it, take credit for it, make sure you document it.
Because a lot of the times, Dan and I will ask the question, and before we can even get the button pushed to send the question, you guys already have the answer. So it's a matter of, yes, you have it sitting right there, you just didn't think to put it in.
Right. The next thing we tried to do was to look at existing glitches or bugs in the incident tracking system to try to take care of those while we had this work being done. One of the things that we noticed on the Others tab was there was no, SSA was not listed under the relationship in the drop down. So, you know, we have direct support professional, we have home manager, transportation provider, nurse, pretty much everybody but the SSA. So we wanted to ensure that that was incorporated there. As you guys know, our ITS system is not real hip on proper punctuation. So if you try to use a comma or apostrophe, a lot of times it would give you an error message. So we've tried to clean that up tab by tab, and the last one is the summary tab. We've tried to fix those things. So hopefully that will be corrected. We tried to fix some spacing issues. We know sometimes it seemed like boxes and tabs were overlapping, and we do recognize that in different browsers this application works differently. I myself have to use, you know, Chrome in certain applications and Internet Explorer and others, so we do recognize that's been an issue. Finally, one of the changes we're most excited about is we think we have corrected so that when you enter the investigator in under the investigator tab, it will only save once. If you've noticed that your name has been saved 3 times on the investigator tab, and then every time a question's posted or something, an email is sent to you, it's sent 3 times. It's not that we're playing a trick on you. That's just the way the system automates. So if your name is in there 3 times, you're being notified 3 times. So we apologize for that, and we're hoping that that's going to be corrected in these changes. Moving real quick through this, we know some changes, just cleaning up language from consumer to individual throughout the application. Under the provider tab, you'll see that the provider type is consistent. You know, no longer under the provider type do we have home with waiver and all these kind of other crazy areas. Now it's going to be consistent with PSM, the provider service management application. We tried to clean up some language. Obviously, we don't have workshops. We replaced that with adult day and employment providers. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Children's Services disposition and investigations. For those of you who have been around for a while, you know that back in 2013, when we had our previous rule revisions, we actually had this work done in the application, but it never went through. And so what we wanted to do is to make sure this time around, when CSB is the lead investigator, there is a place for you to put what their findings are. We include this information here, which we pulled from the administrative code, just some explanation about the different types of investigations. And it kind of spells out what the difference between a traditional response and alternative response CSB investigation is. This is just here for your knowledge. And it also talks about the different kinds of dispositions for a traditional case investigation. But we want to get to the actual application changes, and that is when CSB is the lead investigator, you'll notice on the investigation tab, there's a drop down for CSB, and when that is selected, it's going to populate the actions tab, and it's going to have this area here where it's going to allow you to, first of all, say what kind of investigation it is, whether it's traditional or alternative response, and what the incident category is, and then what the findings are. And so we'll first move through what a traditional investigation tab might look like on the actions tab. So here you'll see we have the two different types of investigations completed by CSB. And then for a traditional, you'll see we have neglect, physical abuse, sexual and verbal. And then finally, whatever the findings or the outcome of that investigation are. And then again, just for your reference, we provided what each of these different findings definitions are in the Ohio Administrative Code. And then finally, we have the alternative response, where you see for the alternative response, you can select the different kind of allegation type, but under the findings section, that's going to be grayed out because it's not going to allow you to have a finding on that type of investigation. Just quickly, we want to move moving forward. We have a webcast tomorrow, which is going to step out and go over all the MUI rule changes, the rationale for those changes, and provide some additional information. We have a live chat scheduled for January 23rd. We are finalizing the frequently asked questions and interpretive guidelines, which will be coming out probably later this week, early next week, and we will issue that to the MUI listserv. And then we're also in the process of looking all the agency and different independent provider requirements at a glance and all the other supporting documents we have. We're going to be revising the Incident Tracking System User Guide. And with this process, just like any, we're really relying on you to provide us feedback, and we want to make changes and revisions to make this as workable and as fluid a process as possible. I know we've had a bunch of questions come in, and so I'm just going to take a couple minutes. If you're able to stick with us for a couple of these questions, feel free to do that. If you have to jump off because you have another time commitment, we completely understand. We thank you for your time and your attention. We will be posting this webinar, and we'll also be posting the PowerPoint presentation. Like I said, any questions or comments that have been asked, we will be typing up and sending to everyone that has participated. One of the MUI managers just asked a question about the CSB cases and said sometimes our findings may be different than what the investigator at CSB comes up with. And we did try to address that. Chris Young in our office, it was his feedback that we also continue to have the substantiation above the CSB section of the Actions tab. And so if they decide that something is not going to be substantiated, but you felt very strongly through the information and evidence that you had that it should be substantiated, you'll have the ability to also have that added into the Actions tab. So I hope that addresses that question. Some of the questions I think we've addressed, like how can two providers be addressed in one MUI, and that's through the use of two incident providers. Some of this is really practical, and we're going to have to work together to come up with, when there's multiple categories that may be under different appendix, like you have a physical abuse, and then you may have something else like an unanticipated hospitalization. Again, we don't want to lose sight of getting all that information that is relative and relevant for that one investigation category into the system. But we're hoping that concisely all that information can be added into one report that makes sense. And so that's how we're kind of envisioning that. But we're going to work with you throughout this process to make sure that we address those things. And certainly we hope that you'll call upon your regional manager, the investigator that's assigned to your county board, to make sure that we address those questions as they come up. Let's see. One of the questions is around if we have multiple categories, will there be one primary MUI category? And really, we're not looking at it that way. We're looking at it as one MUI with multiple categories. You know, obviously there may be one that you feel is more egregious or more serious than another. That certainly may be the case. From a data perspective, we're looking at this. We're not going to lose sight of, you know, we know that our MUI numbers, just sheer numbers of MUIs may decrease, but the categories really themselves, while we may see a decline in neglect and some peer-to-peer physical acts, they're not going to be that much different. We're still going to be looking at rates of physical abuse for individuals with developmental disabilities in Ohio and working on prevention and stuff like that. So we're going to kind of be looking at it that way and still capturing how many times physical abuse happens for someone, how many times neglect happens for someone, regardless if it's one MUI or two MUIs. Let's see, there are a whole bunch of questions, so I'm just going to shoot a couple of these and we'll try to address them, and then we'll have to probably get off the line here. One question, oh, pardon me, a bird just flew into our window. One question would be, would there be exception about adding a death category to an unanticipated hospitalization if someone was released from the hospital and died of a different cause? So let's say they were admitted to the hospital and then later released and then died at home from a heart attack.
Would we make you file a separate MUI? No. A lot of times some of the individuals go into the hospital for one thing, but when they're discharged, it's something completely different. Or when they die, whatever they went into the hospital is an underlying cause of their actual death. So no, we wouldn't make you file a separate one.
And I think the next question is a really good one. And it says, you know, for someone that dies of a choking, and would we add a medical emergency to that? So I guess if the person choked, let's say they were eating a peanut butter sandwich, staff did some life-saving measure, and then they later died as a result, yes, you would have two alleged categories. One would be for the medical emergency. The second might be the accidental choking death, and you would see those two carried out on the decided categories.
And you also might have an unanticipated hospitalization in that as well, because sometimes they will choke, they'll go to the hospital, they'll be in the hospital on life support for a week or so, and then they might unfortunately pass away. That does happen, so you would have all three categories in that as well.
And that's a great example to illustrate how right now, current day, we would have three separate MUIs, or potentially two or three. And moving forward for that one person, we may have one MUI with three categories. And we hope you'll see that that might be a better use of everyone's time. We're still capturing everything we need to, looking at cause contributing factors and incident-specific protocol requirements, but making sure that that's all addressed in that report. Some of these I'm not, so one of the questions is, when we have an unknown primary person involved, we know that the relationship box says unknown. Currently in the test environment, it is still making us put in a person's name. So I've had to put in unknown and then select the unknown. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get that fixed before we move in our release date of January 2nd, but we're working on that. And so right now, a lot of times people are asking, you know, should we move towards this kind of new way of thinking before January 2nd? And we're going to tell you to go ahead and operate as you do today based on everything. We really don't have the application changes up and running. The MUI rule, while we feel very strongly it's going to go into effect January 1st, it still has to go through JCAR to be finalized. And so let's operate with the current rule and the current system the way that we have it. And then moving forward, we'll obviously send out all this information, but January 2nd is when we're projected to go live with these incident tracking changes. given that we're a couple of minutes past 2:30, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We, again, want to thank you for your time. You guys do an amazing job of capturing everything that needs to be entered into the incident tracking system. And we really do appreciate your work. We know that many of you are investigative agents and MUI contacts, and this is just one piece of the very important job that you do. So we thank all of you for that. We want to work with you as we move through this process of these application changes. We know that there are going to be some challenges that come up, things that we did not intend, things that, we really can't anticipate. And so please continue with your patience and to ask questions and provide feedback. And we want to make sure that we're providing guidance and training as we're able to address those kind of things. We will make sure that we get these questions and comments out to you as soon as possible. And again, this information will be posted on the website, and we look forward to working with you in the coming year with the new rule and the new application changes. We think it's going to be a great opportunity to really enhance our system for health and welfare for Hawaiians with disabilities, and we thank you for your work. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much.